So welcome, Julie. Now, we've all been out and about researching and interviewing sort of fund selector over the last 3 or 4 months. Why would we be doing that, and what's the outcome?
We've been working on the launch of our brand new research series, the Investment Week Fund Marketers Playbook.
Yeah.
And we've been talking to these senior fund selectors as well as doing a very selective online survey to really get some actionable insight for fund marketing teams on how to engage with that audience. So we've looked at the investment process, the fund buying journey, along various points of that journey, what are fund selectors looking for, what do they respond to, and how can you really get in and influence that decision-making process.
So we're trying to kind of work out really whether the sort of traditional way of marketing, distributing funds to the fund selector audience actually is in a way that they want to receive that kind of information.
Exactly, yeah, and are they, what sort of issues are they struggling with? What information do they need, and how well served do they feel by the fund groups in the information that they need to make their decisions, and what factors are influencing their decision-making process. We've also taken a sort of deep look at 4 specific fund sectors. So we look at the rather ubiquitous multi-asset, we look at European equities, emerging markets, and then a broader category sort of across the board of funds that are targeting a higher alpha outcome. And again, what we've tried to do with this report, which I think is really key, is to break the mold a little bit, do something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. So rather than kind of going for the general kind of tick box questions, we've taken the step of creating some hypothetical fund launches so that we can really test opinion amongst fund selectors of those funds and fund features and descriptions and words and phrases that talk about those funds, and we can really see what resonates and what attracts their attention. And Lawrence, you've been out, talking to these guys. You've been sat in their offices, hearing them, going through our sort of imaginary funds. Do you think the approach has worked? Do you think it's given us some? Yeah,
I mean, I found it a really interesting kind of experience, sort of doing a lot of the interviews, which kind of Mitchell has had to sort of plough through. So I'll kind of ask him in a minute kind of what struck him, but. Yeah, I think you're right. Some of the language that's commonly used to describe investment processes, sort of fund strategies, in a way, I think for some of the respondees, they found a bit dated in many ways, and I think again they're almost a bit too used to fund groups coming to them saying, well, that fund sector's doing really, really well, so we've decided to launch one, without actually trying to figure out whether there's a gap in the portfolios of the fund selectors for another type of that sort of fund. So, as you quite rightly mentioned, the sort of 4 asset classes that we asked some questions around. Again, that was sort of kind of quite interesting. I mean, Mitchell, from your perspective, so you ploughed through the transcripts of a lot of the interviews, many of which I did, so you've heard me waffling away. I mean, as somebody who, is a researcher by trade, you're not an expert in investment, what are the sort of things that kind of struck you that came out sort of most clearly?
I think there were a couple of things. I think first and foremost, what struck me was that senior fund selectors are looking for solutions more than products. I would have assumed the latter, but actually they're looking for it in terms of what their end client wants. Yeah. And on that note, also another finding that really interested me was that they're looking not for they're looking for originality in terms of the solutions on offer that asset managers provide. It seems to be no good to be second or third or fourth to the punch. To be first is to be first and to kind of hold sway in terms of the solutions that you provide, in terms of the funds that you provide. So they're not looking for a Me Too product.
And Julie, I mean, why did we, obviously I asked all the questions to the people that I interviewed, but why did we pick on sort of European equities, emerging markets, as you say, multi-asset, which covers a multitude of sins, and sort of high alpha again? So, what I found was that people had sort of clear views on European equities, emerging market equities, but because of the very broad nature of multi-asset and high alpha, they found that kind of a bit harder to sort of express really kind of firm opinions on. Why did we pick those sort of 4 categories?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think that was one of the really interesting things that came out of those, looking at those 4 fund groups, fund sectors. So in choosing them, the kind of rationale for going for those sectors was, we wanted to tackle some areas that were of fairly broad interest, and obviously there's those are 4 categories that have had a lot of interest in 2017, and as we go into next year, I think we've seen that most of our fund selectors that we interviewed and surveyed are either planning to hold or increase their allocation to those sectors. So luckily, I think we've gone for some popular areas where there's a lot of activity and a lot of launch. The higher alpha sort of category particularly was something that our editorial team on Investment Week have seen more launches coming out in that sort of when you're trying to set your active fund apart from the competition, when you're looking for a good outcome for investors, there's some thought about kind of trying to look for funds that pursue that higher alpha outcome, and I think just to kind of get some interesting insight for marketers who are looking at it, who have funds or are launching funds in those areas, and giving them some insight into what's missing. So for example, in multi-asset, there are something like 178 funds with not an awful lot perhaps on the surface to choose between them. So I think it's really interesting to explore those areas and see actually what really does resonate with that audience, what really does attract their attention, and what perhaps might be best brought to the fore to get some more airtime.
Mitchell, one thing, one of the questions we asked was about the use of boutiques, small independent type managers and the full sort of multi-service type sort of groups. What was the kind of outcome? Because I sort of know the response from the people I interviewed, but across the whole sort of panel, was there a clear sort of more like the full service or more like the boutiques? Because certainly from the interviews I did, people sort of said, well, we don't really have a preference. We research the market and we look at a fund for its own merits. We don't, and then we look at the sort of group behind it. And if we happen to have more boutiques over full service, that's just almost a kind of an accident of our process.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the findings that emerged from our research. The fund selector audience were not wedded to large providers for the sake of their size, nor boutiques for the opposite reason. It's very much about getting the right solution, no matter where it came from. That being said, we did identify a couple of pros and cons, shall we say, about either type of group. Larger houses obviously have scale, that can help, but also boutiques, on the other hand, a lot of top manager talent is seen to be going towards the boutique part of the market. So definitely strengths in either field, but not a sense of being wedded to one or the other. Getting the right solution is paramount. And
Julie, in terms of the information that fund management groups currently give to the sort of fund selectors, again, there seems to be largely a good level of satisfaction with it. Actually, I kind of maybe slightly cynically expect them to say, "Oh God, we get all this kind of waffly, superfluous information," but they seem to suggest that the relationship was good. There was a good openness, transparency. Kind of interestingly enough, they did a lot of work on their own before they engaged with the sales team. Yeah,
I think the information question is a really interesting one, and transparency that you just touched on really came to the fore. And I think what we've seen from the fund selectors that we interviewed is that they really respond and value groups that have gone a bit beyond what they absolutely have to provide in terms of transparency. So just that sense of kind of openness and of willingness to share good and bad information really seems to go a long way. I think one of the other things that's one of the other sort of themes that's come through in the report, I think, is really interesting. It's something that personally interests me a lot about the industry, is that balance between the sort of human aspect of the role of being a fund selector and that kind of information and data and quant screening and so on. What was your sort of impression of the role of fund selector these days, and between the kind of...
It's a great point, because I mean, clearly they all use the statistical databases, the Morningstars, the FEs, the Lipper that are available, and they learn a certain amount. But I mean, certainly what overridingly came through for me was it's about quality of relationships. One of the fund selectors sort of talked about actually how they follow individuals, not just the fund managers, around their careers. So when somebody they know well on the sales side or even the fund management side pitches up at a group they don't know, they tend to ring them up and say, tell us about that group, and that they were saying was one of the best idea generators for them.
There was a great quote I really liked about how fund selectors find funds the same way that fund managers find stocks. Really great new ideas don't just jump out of a screen. You've got to get out, meet people, listen to people, talk to people, work that contact book.
And I thought you're right. That was a sort of great quote, because again, it, to me, plays to the sort of value of what fund selection is. I mean, again, there's a danger that everything becomes very commoditized, always all about price.
Yeah.
And price is important, but actually, ultimately, these are investment decisions. So the fund selectors, it's about the quality of them finding the kind of right managers and sort of blending them, and that seemed to come through abundantly to me in the way they sort of all kind of worked. Because we're going to keep this short and sweet. Mitch, one last thought from you before I ask sort of Julie how people can access the report.
Well, in terms of key findings, and things that interested me, ESG. I would have thought that ESG was becoming more of an important factor in the fund selection process. As it turns out, there's mixed opinion there. For some, it's very important. For others, not so. What I'd be interested to see as the millennial generation starts to come into its peak earning years, starts to inherit a lot of wealth, whether that starts to change in the future, that's something perhaps to keep an eye on.
Yeah, actually, really good point. I think one or two people, do look at ESG factors within fund selection where they have portfolios of funds that are like that, but by and large, most of them didn't mention it as being sort of a priority, which I completely agree with you. So, just finally, Julie, how do we get hold of the report?
Contact me. We want to get out and we want to talk to the groups about what we've done. We want to talk through some of the key findings. I got out and about and met a few sort of heads of marketing at the beginning of this process to find out what people really wanted to know. I think we've created something really interesting. We want to go back and see how it lands with marketing teams. And I've got one last question for you. Yeah. So you spent a lot of time out in fund selectors' offices, sitting in front of them, talking to them. Do you think that the kind of growth of data, the pressure on fees, all these sorts of issues, have they taken the fun out of fund selecting for these guys, or do you get the sense talking to them there's still that do they get a real kick out of it?
I think coming back to the point about fund managers finding good stocks, they get a real kick when they find a fund manager that perhaps is either their fund is small and it looks like it's going to get some momentum. So a fantastic example would be the even load income fund that people got into 4 or 5 years ago. But there's just generally moments like that don't happen often enough. There is definitely a bit of a weariness, and I think it's largely because getting over the value for money argument about fund selectors is in danger of getting lost when people just want to talk about how cheap or not is a particular investment fund. So look, we've interviewed some fantastically experienced people who are old enough, and as I said to many of them, you're ugly enough to sort of get through this kind of regulatory cost environment. But the moments of real satisfaction for finding a new fund manager, unfortunately, is not as common as many of them would like. And I know you've got a whole roster of ideas for 2018, so this is the sort of first report since you've joined Investment Week Insighted Media. So I guess people should look forward to hearing sort of many things from sort of you and Mitch in 2018.
We hope so.
Good stuff. Julie, Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thank you.